So, it's been a while. Sorry about that. Not to make any excuses, but I did have a fair few exams, and I had to spend most of my time studying. And after I was done with that, I honestly had trouble convincing myself to work on anything. Not really helping the situation, Dragonflight came out right about the time of my last exam, and I might have put a few hours into it. But it's not been a month and a bit since it came out, giving me some time to really form my own opinions about it, and what I think are its shortcomings. Which is why I'm making this video. This will be a summary of what I personally find to be the most important shortcomings of this recent expansion, and the hope that Blizzard would listen to community feedback, and also in part because I just find it fun to critique things. So with that out of the way, I'm going to be starting with the non-combat parts of my critique. As most of you know, or I assume so at least seeing how you're watching a WoW critique video, Blizzard revamped their profession system, and I want to come right out at the start and say that it is a massive success. This new system is leagues better than the other ones. Though if I'm being honest, almost anything would be, as the last system was pretty much as bare bones as it could possibly be. But even though I find it to be an overall success, that doesn't mean that I think it's good yet. They've succeeded in making professions more complicated in that by adding skill trees that you can spec into, something that has also made your choices feel more impactful. But the system still has its kinks. While I do think they've succeeded in making their professions feel more distinct from one another, this isn't purely positive. One of the ways they differ the most is in how much of a pain they are to level. Certain professions are infinitely easier to level than others. A profession such as jewel crafting is overall easy to level as there aren't any restrictions. Well, except for metal, but I'll get to that. And then there's alchemy. I was initially pretty excited to try out new professions, but alchemy really drained that excitement right out of me. So the way you level alchemy is by experimenting to get new recipes. This on its own is honestly a pretty neat system and does make it stand out from the other crafters, but it does come with a pretty hefty downside. As you are crafting, there is a fairly high chance that you will just randomly blow up. This makes it so you are unable to experiment for 4 hours, locking yourself out of progression for that time. This can be extremely frustrating as it isn't all that uncommon to blow up on your second or even third experimentation. You can get an item that removes the cooldown, but you do not get enough of them to completely ignore the cooldown every time, unless you're extremely lucky. Experimenting also requires a special material called Artisan's Metal, which is a material you are unable to grind to get. You can only get it by doing certain quests and weeklies, or by making new craft, which most of the time also requires you to spend metal. So if you're unlucky and you don't get any new recipes from experimentation, you can easily softlock yourself until next week rolls around, and you finally get some more metal. This also creates a big problem if you're wanting to do 2 crafting professions on the same character, as every crafting profession uses metal, and the metal is universal for all crafters. So in my experience, this pretty much barred my character from having a second crafting profession, at least for the first week or 2. But as I said at the start, I don't think it's all bad. While I do think the changes are good, I just don't think that the crafting system overall is where it needs to be considered good. And that's completely fine. The crafting system is currently completely new, and will need a lot of fine tuning from Blizzard until it is as good as it can be. And I think as a player base we should be patient and give them the time they need to make it as good as it can be. That is obviously assuming that Blizzard does actually make changes to the system, but for once I will choose to be optimistic and look forward to what Blizzard would be able to create with this new template they have. Moving on from crafters, we have gatherers, my own profession of choice. Gathering is the main way I've been making money on WoW for pretty much the entire time that I've been playing it. It's pretty chill, so I usually just put on a show or a YouTube video on my second monitor as I fly around. The changes they've made to gatherers this expansion are fairly similar to what they did to crafters, as we also got a skill tree and a bit more complicated gearing. As far as both of these go, I think they're fantastic and I much prefer them over the old system. But this is a critique video, so that's to be some negativity in this section. And this might come as a surprise, but it's actually the dragon riding. Now don't get me wrong, I think dragon riding is great. It's easily one of the best features we've ever gotten in WoW, and it makes both questing and exploring infinitely more enjoyable. I have always been one of those players that's always wanted Blizzard to just make flying available from the very start of the expansion, and this is that, but 1,000 times better. Where I start having problems with dragon riding is when it's used for gathering. Usually as you fly, managing your meter is very easy and you're pretty much never going to run out of bulges. This is both true for flying long distance and while questing, but the same is not true for gathering. As you're gathering, you're forced to land a lot. I don't know if the devs just didn't test this at all, but you run out of meter extremely fast doing this, which leads to a very frustrating waiting game where you'll land, gather your herb or mining node, and then most likely you'll just have to wait until you naturally generate an orb, so you can then take off again. Only to then land almost immediately as another node pops up just a bit further away, rinse and repeat. I find this to be a pretty pointless problem to have, as it would be ridiculously easy to fix. Just don't limit the flying with this arbitrary meter system you currently have. Can't really think of any reason they decided to limit it in the first place. It just feels like the sort of decision that was made just because it's a video game, and that's the sort of thing you have in video games. I'd be interested to hear some counter arguments against this, but as it stands, I just simply don't understand why dragon riding is the way it is currently. and I really hope they at the very least substantially buff it for gathering in the future. Lastly, to cap off the non-combat section, though admittedly this is somewhat of an in-between, I want to talk about the new race and class. So in World of Warcraft, we usually have gotten either a new race or a new class every expansion, often either being every other or both at the same time. But for the last expansion, Shadowlands, we got neither, so it was more or less guaranteed that we would get one or the other this time around. And we were right, as we got the new race Dracthyr and the new class Evoker. At first, this was pretty exciting news, as it's always nice to get a new class and or race, and getting both at the same time is just even better. But this time around, it came with a pretty major drawback. Not only was Dracthyr the only race able to play Evoker, but Evoker was actually the only class that was able to play at all. Now I have pretty mixed feelings about this. On one hand, this makes it so that Blizzard was able to design them pretty much in such a way that they both complement each other, something that has resulted in a very unique result as far as WoW classes go. But on the other hand, by limiting the new class and race in such a way, you make it so that people that do not want to play one or the other have to make a compromise or just completely ignore the new content altogether. This is admittedly a greedy way of looking at it, and you could technically say this about past classes and races as well, but by making them exclusive to each other, you run the risk of excluding a lot more people than by releasing them individually. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this approach. I can appreciate the attempt, and that Blizzard was willing to experiment, but overall I just don't find it to be worth it. Moving on to combat, and I want to start with a talent system revamp. Honestly, I don't have any complaints about it. Even though WoW is an extremely min-max game, there's still a fair amount of variety in builds that people run, especially in the raid. As a Windwalker main, I pretty much changed talents between every single fight. A lot of the time, I ended up making pretty major changes like changing my cooldown between Storm, Earth and Fire and Serenity. Obviously, this hasn't been a huge hit for every spec, but that is to be expected with the amount of specs that's in the game currently. Blizzard seems to be planning on revamping certain trees already, so that's good. As for Mythic Plus, I don't really have much to say as they didn't really change much. They kept the changes they made in Season 4 of Shadowlands, wherein only half the dungeons are from this expansion, and the other half is a plethora of dungeons from past expansions. This was a really good change, and I'm glad that they kept it, even though I'm not a massive fan of the dungeons they chose for this season. It does come with some pretty major imbalances between the dungeons, where certain dungeons are extremely hard, meanwhile some are complete jokes. They have tried to remedy this with nerfs, but even after a month, it still feels very lopsided. My only real problem with this season is the seasonal affix thundering. Seasonal affixes have a tendency to be pretty hit or miss, but this time around I found it to be a fairly big miss. So if you aren't aware, the kernel seasonal affix is thundering, which will mark every player in the dungeon with either a positive charge or a negative charge on a set timer. These marks will give a player a 30% damage buff, but they have to dispel their marks by walking into a player with the opposite charge. If they fail to do this, the player with the mark still on them after 15 seconds will be stunned and take damage equal to roughly 100% of their max HP. To put it bluntly, it's just not a very fun affix to play with. Just conceptually, it's annoying having to constantly be aware of the people around you and what charge they have, and can lead to extended downtime if you're forced to dispel it with a ranged player when you're melee and vice versa. To make it even worse, the actual visual for the affix is just bad. It can be extremely hard to tell which charge you have on you if you get it during a large pull or at any time where there's a lot going on. This makes it an affix you pretty much have to have an add-on for, which isn't exactly ideal. It is also just a really unfriendly affix to pugs. Having to sync up with random players and non-verbally communicate who's going to break with who has created a lot of unfortunate situations. It's not so bad that it doesn't make me want to do dungeons, but it certainly isn't motivating me to do more. The other thing I want to bring up about Mythic Plus, which has to do with their current system of running old content. It is very clear that Blizzard did minimal testing with the old content to make sure that it's up to par with current WoW. There's been a plethora of issues with older dungeons, such as with the difficulty scaling and with certain mechanics barely working. The two most obvious examples being the sphere mechanic on the second boss of Halls of Valor, and the lines in the last boss of Court of Stars. Both of these were extremely hard to see, and was made even worse if you played on lower graphical setting. This made it so the actual difficulty mechanic wasn't dodging, it was actually being able to see the mechanic at all. Both of these were later fixed, but it took Blizzard up to a month to do so, when it could have easily been done day one if they assigned some random intern to do it. This is pretty consistent with Blizzard's general approach of live testing the game, something that I'm not really a big fan of. I find it to be pretty lazy, and I don't think a lot of other devs would get away with intentionally releasing unfinished content just to fix it later. Next up we have the big one, the raid. For the first tier of the expansion, we got the Vault of the Incarnates. I'm going to be real, it's a pretty big letdown. I'm usually a pretty negative person when it comes to WoW, but I've almost always found the raids to be extremely enjoyable. Sadly, I can't really say the same about this current tier. My main problem with the Vault of the Incarnates comes from its difficulty. I don't want this to make me sound arrogant, but I think it's just way too easy. This mostly stems from there simply not being enough changes between normal and heroic. As it stands, the only boss that has any significant change between the two difficulties is Dracthyr. Other than her, the only real changes simply boil down to heal more. Take her for example. Changes between normal and heroic are shooting out some balls during the ice phase and spawning a few more ads in the stone phase. Other than that, the changes just boils down to the boss doing more damage or adding a healing soak on players so they might have to pop a defensive or two. I bet you most DPS players didn't even notice anything different other than the two first changes I mentioned. And yes, I do have the option to do Mythic if I find normal and heroic to be too easy. But the problem with that is pugging anything more than 2 out of 8 Mythic is extremely difficult. I'm not really that interesting of an experience. I'm not really interested in joining any sort of static group or guild to try and prog it either. Obviously this isn't a grand statement where I think it's wrong of them to have this approach, but I personally find it to diminish my personal enjoyment of the raid, and hope this isn't the general approach they're going to have going forwards. Next we have the biggest change to raiding we've had in a while. The loot system changing from personal loot to group loot. If you aren't caught up to date, basically, the way it worked before Dragonflight is that when a boss was killed, it would just give out a certain amount of loot to random people in the raid. It was then up to the players themselves to dole out this loot if they didn't need it themselves. This was changed to group loot, which is a system where the items drop for everyone, and then the players proceed to roll on it, and then the person with the highest roll wins the gear. I know that personal loot has been a pretty controversial system ever since it was put in place during MOB, but I have personally never had a problem with it. I do agree that it does minimize the MMO feeling of the game by further restricting the amount you have to interact with other players, but overall I found this to be for the better, as it made for a more reliable raiding experience when it came to loot. Fast forward to the time of writing, and we have had about a month to play around with group loot, with the current verdict being that it kinda sucks. Now this is going to be the most biased part of this entire video, but to put it bluntly, I've been royally fucked by group loot. I've done 8 out of 8 normal and 7 out of 8 heroic every single week since release, and I've got a total of 2 items during the entire time. Now obviously, I've been extremely unlucky, but it doesn't really change the fact that it happened and it sucked pretty hard for me. It was extremely demoralizing to clear the entire raid week after week without getting any loot. To fully put into perspective how bad this is, I have to explain another mechanic that was added back into the game this expansion, that being tier sets. Tier sets are pieces of gear that will have a certain effect when you get 2 pieces and 4 pieces respectively. For Windwalkers for example, the tier set makes my main spender do more damage, with 2 piece giving me roughly 5.5% and 4 piece giving me an 8% damage increase. For certain spec, this damage increase goes all the way up to 15%, making them pretty much essential. Now the problem stems from you only being able to get these pieces from the raid or your vault, but we'll get to the vault in a bit. So you can see how this creates a huge problem when you're unlucky and unable to get any pieces from your weekly lockouts. Like this wasn't bad enough, Blizzard also added another new system in the way it distributes these pieces. Basically, to get a tier piece, you don't roll on the specific piece, instead the boss will drop a forge stone that a certain group of classes will share. On its own, this isn't really all that great, as it creates a lot of competition for each drop. To make it even worse is the way the classes are distributed among the forge stones. For example, the forge stone that I want is shared among monks, warriors, rogues, and evoker. Now, we don't have the actual numbers on which are the most played classes, but there is little doubt that these are most likely 4 out of the top 5 right now. This stems from the fact that all these classes are extremely strong, with Rogue being the strongest DPS in general, Prot Warrior being the strongest tank, and Evoker being the strongest healer. So my Forge Stone in particular is extremely contested, which helps explain why I have been so unlucky with getting tier pieces. Another pretty major downside with how the Forge system works is that when players are creating pugs, they're majorly incentivized to not invite players who share that Forge Stone with themselves, making it much harder to join pugs. There have also been several bugs with the new loot system, making it so it was possible to roll on items you already had, and even being able to get 2 at the same time if you were lucky enough. This has resulted in people holding items hostage and selling them for gold to other players in the raid. This has personally happened to me, so I don't think it's particularly a rare occurrence. This also took Blizzard an entire month to fix, which is honestly just unacceptable. All this coupled together has made it so the only reliable way of getting tier pieces is from the vault. But even this is heavily RNG reliant, though most of everyone I know personally has almost always gotten a tier piece from their vault every week. This still does make it so that it takes roughly 4 to 5 weeks for someone to get their Forge set, which is absurd when a lot of people had theirs week 1 or 2. Now, Blizzard is finally rolling out a system where you'll be able to create tier pieces from Mythic Plus gear, but it's simply just a little too late now. This system of gearing has demoted the vault to simply being a means of getting tier pieces, and if you're unlucky enough not to get one, it just feels extremely bad. The way gearing works right now is just simply unfun and unrewarding. Now, I feel like a lot of people will disagree with this and say that I'm too focused on gearing fast and getting big numbers, but I just think that this is how the game is currently. You need to gear fast to be able to get into half decent groups. Pumping numbers and doing as well as possible is just what WoW has evolved into. If I was a very casual player that'd like to take it slow in prog, then I don't think I would mind this nearly as much. But that simply just is not the type of player I am, nor is it the type of game I think WoW is anymore. I don't think this looting system has a place in the current World of Warcraft. It might have worked 2 decades ago when being a dick had consequences, but currently there just isn't any incentive to be a nice person, other than your own morals. Well, after all those negative thoughts, I want to clarify that I overall think that Dragonflight is a good expansion. There are plenty of really great additions that I didn't mention, as this is meant to be a critique. For example, this expansion is extremely all-friendly. Leveling is the fastest it's ever been, and I don't think I've seen an expansion with better catch-up possibilities at max level. There is the aforementioned crafting system, which I think is an overall pretty massive upgrade. One of the biggest of these being the crafting order system they made. While I think this, like most of the other additions, can do with some changes, I think it's overall a pretty great mechanic. There's also a whole plethora of extra stuff that you can do to fill in the time, or stuff that is perfect for casual players. My overall opinion of the expansion is that it's a massive step in the right direction. Blizzard has made a great basis on which they can build upon to either make this expansion one of the best ones, or at the very least, make the next expansion a truly great one. I do have my reservations about Blizzard as a company. In this one instance, I really do hope they can surpass my expectations instead of letting me down once again.